Hi, everybody. The group had a reunion dinner last night at Raylene and Lisa Ann's, and they originally had been suggested that in each of the days of the week they would get 5 minutes to share about a day, and they thought, that sounds way too tough. How about more like 9 minutes, and then we'll hope there's a little bit of time left at the end for question and answer. And in a very extreme rarity for an adult ed session, I just heard 3 voices up here say, we should start now, we should start now. So they are eager to get to share with you. Welcome, welcome online. We hope that the stream and recording works so that as many as possible get to hear these stories.
First of all, don't we look great?
Except me that keeps getting pointed out.
Welcome, everyone. We're so glad you're here. I am Larry Henning, member of Advent, and I'm one of 6 folks who went to the border for a border immersion trip in early February. And here we all are. Sarah's back there. She went, but she's running the show back there. Here we all are, +1. Where are you, Don? Don, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I forgot. I'm over here.
You're the +1. Yeah. Our experience was with the Border Servant Corps. The Border Servant Corps started in a Lutheran church in Las Cruces, New Mexico, but has now become a separate nonprofit that provides welcome and support to thousands of migrant siblings in Las Cruces and El Paso. Along with their varied ministries, they also do immersion experiences to give folks like us a first-hand look at what is really happening at the southern border. My sound's going in and out, but that's all right. We were there for 6 days, and so each of us who went will reflect on one of those days. I had day 1. 5 of us flew down Sunday morning of February 4th, arriving mid-afternoon. Nick came later that night because he preached Sunday morning. The first official part of our experience was touring the Chamizal National Memorial near the border in El Paso. The memorial marks the peaceful resolution in 1963 of a 100-year-long border dispute. There it is, holy cow, between Mexico and U.S. In short, the problem was this. The border was the Rio Grande, but the old river kept moving. So what happened to the border when the river kept changing? The answer is 100 years of argument. And of course, many residents suffered in the process, and residents suffered by the resolution. Anyway, at the memorial, we first met up with Ashley, our young guide for the week. Ashley is funny, warm, kind, and proud of her Mexican heritage. She was the first of a whole parade of people we met through the week who knocked our socks off with their compassion for God's beloved seeking refuge. Here's the bottom line for me. I confess I wasn't wild about going. I signed up out of duty. I do that a lot. But what I didn't realize was how much I needed this trip. Daily, I get weighed down by the cruelty we see in the world, including this morning, by the way. But this trip reminded me that love and compassion are also alive in the world. Thanks be to God. After Chamizal, we drove to from El Paso to Las Cruces, about an hour, I think, and settled into our home away from home. And I've got to say, it was a true delight to spend the week with these wonderful folks. All right.
Could we turn off the lights?
Oh, definitely.
So I'm going to turn it over to Sarah. We're going to do a little tag team.
Oh, yeah, a picture of our band anyway.
Yeah. Hi, I thought you might want some context in case your sense of geography isn't quite up to snuff. There's the border this long border that is mostly talked about, even though we have a much longer border north, obviously. The heart on the screen is El Paso. I personally hadn't realized quite how far west, to almost in New Mexico, El Paso is. And there, New Mexico and Texas are outlined. And also this is a close-up of the area, and you can see this is a lot of high desert. And up there is, by the way, the white spot is White Sands National Park. But here is the area down here with the border. You can see the border down at the bottom, which is the Rio Grande, and then Ciudad Juarez and El Paso are right there. So, the next slide. So this shows the places where we were a lot. The circle there is Chamizal National Memorial, which is the park Larry just talked about, which is right next to one of the crossing points in El Paso. The heart is the other crossing point in El Paso, and we went there the next day to talk to Border Patrol. The red dot is where we actually crossed, because it takes often 4 hours at least to get back from Mexico to the U.S. at the crossing points in from Juarez to El Paso, and it only took us an hour and a half. So, and then that picture up there is to just show those are major highways. There is a lot of traffic going back and forth between Ciudad Juarez and El Paso every day. People commute back and forth, and it just is an example of how close our partnership is with our biggest trading partner. I think I'm done.
All right, and so Monday is the day I'll talk about, and we had a very packed day on Monday, as you can see. The Border Patrol, then we went to the Welcome Center for BSC, which is right at the border, and then we also went to the airport and to the Las Cruces Hospitality Center, where they actually have the intake for all of the migrants who are there for a brief period of time. And so I'm gonna just quickly walk you through the slides, just kind of one at a time, and then I'm gonna give you an overview of my impressions of the day, just because I think it'd be easier to have some visualization of what I'll be talking about as we see them kind of quickly. So here's the border where we met with the border agents, and we had a meeting with them for about an hour, and they just went through what their daily life was like in policing the border. So you can forward through to show. So they're the border agents we met with. And then after meeting them, we went to the airport. That part of the trip, I didn't actually get to participate because I had to go to the rental car agency to change the name of who the driver was on the rental agreement. And so, but I'll tell you a little bit about that event as well. And this is at the port of entry where the Welcome Center was. Now, one thing you'll see in our pictures, there were quite a few places where we went where we weren't allowed to take pictures. Like, they didn't want us, for good reason, taking any pictures inside any of the facilities we were going to. So the shelters, the Welcome Center, any place where the migrants would be living and eating, they didn't want any pictures. And so we have some pictures of the outside and what the border was like, but there'll be different things we'll be talking about where we don't have pictures of the inside. And this is one example of that, was this Welcome Center at the border. But you can see, right back, the little lights you see on the thing that goes over the road, that's the border. And we were standing on the U.S. side, and the people were coming over then to be processed at this Welcome Center that I'll say a few more words about after you see the rest of the pictures. This is just a mural of Moses welcoming, what was Moses doing, Nick? Pointing to the promised land, right. Yeah, so I couldn't remember what, Nick took that picture. And then here's the airport where they're processing, helping people get on the planes to leave El Paso. And they have people from the BSC there from 3 in the morning when the first flights are going out till after midnight until the last flight is leaving to help people be able to get on the right planes. And these are mostly college students who are volunteers and just helping the families make sure they get to the right place, because many of these people don't speak English. And so just to have someone there that can get them in the point in the right direction is a huge service that they provide. And then finally, we ended up in Las Cruces at the BSC Hospitality Center, and this was the place where hundreds of people are coming in, pretty much every day. They end up staying for somewhere between 24 and 48 hours, and then go on their way to different parts around the country. Okay, so now just a couple what I thought were the key moments from this day for me, and kind of larger takeaways. One is for me, in the broader context of a theme I talked about a little bit last week in my presentation, that immigration being an immensely complex issue, and that a lot of things that we were seeing were things that I hadn't really expected. And the first was meeting the border agents, because in my mind, the border agents were the people on horses whipping people that as they're trying to come across the border, and they were the bad guys of this story. And in my mind, that was kind of the bias that I had coming in. But the people that we met, Sarah, if you could go back to the border agent pictures, the people that we met, these were, like, again, just incredibly compassionate, good people, like just trying to do their job every day. And I think on balance, the border agents, probably, they save more people's lives by rescuing them in the desert and bringing them in then, to the system, than the pictures we see in the media of them, whipping people when they're riding their horses. And so that to me humanized a part of this that I had in my mind hadn't really humanized. That just was engaging in biased pictures of these people. And then the second thing then was at that welcome center, where at the border, where the BSC folks are welcoming people as they cross in. Now, this is a legal port of entry, so people who are coming across at that point aren't the ones that are being apprehended between legal ports of entry. So there's a whole different process for processing those folks, but eventually most of them end up in the asylum system. But what we witnessed there that was, I think, again, something I hadn't fully realized, is how the app that the Biden administration set up, the CPB-1 app, where you apply to get into the asylum system before you cross the border, is really working quite efficiently to process people quickly as they come in. And they have a thing set up in the welcome center we were with a couple agents from the Border Patrol agency that were taking pictures, so they get an ID right away. And once they're in the system, they get a work permit in 30 days instead of 180 days. And this allows them to go to wherever they're going and immediately start contributing to our economy and to be productive citizens rather than having to wait for 6 months. And as I mentioned last week, almost 500,000 people now have been processed in this system of the app, and the BSC folks were actually contacted by the Border Patrol agents to collaboratively set this up. They needed a space where they could set up their table, and it was just like a little folding table like we have back there, and they had their little folding chairs, and this operation had been going for about 18 months, I think. And it was just another great example of a collaboration between everyone there that are trying their best to help the people who are coming across the border. And then the third thing that I wanted to mention was at the BSC Hospitality Center when we got there in Las Cruces. First of all, coming in GPS is pretty good. Like every now and then it would go out and we'd get lost. My worst experience driving was when we got into Mexico. I headed down the wrong side of a divided highway, and we were driving, and it was pretty, not much traffic, and I was driving for, maybe half a mile, and all of a sudden I see cars, kind of coming at us, and that's kind of funny, and then I realized that we were going the wrong way.
What words did you say?
Well, yeah, I probably said some words that I can't really say in church, but yeah. Oh my goodness, yeah. And so I had to do like a 3-point turn on the shoulder that was like dropping off to get back and go around the right side of the highway. But anyway, so GPS was generally pretty good. But when we pulled up to the BSC headquarters in Las Cruces, it looked like we were pulling into like a military base. There was a guy standing there with an assault weapon and barbed wire fence all over the place. And we found out later that indeed it it was the right place. But all of that was put up to protect the people inside. It wasn't like to keep them from like trying to get out. It was because they had folks who were not happy with the fact that they had immigrants there in Las Cruces, and there had been some threats of violence, and so they had all of this protection there to protect the people who were inside, which is kind of eye-opening. I hadn't expected to see that either. And then once we were inside, if you could go to the pictures of where they had all of the supplies for the folks who were there for the short stay. But they had big rooms where the people would sleep, and they had a huge cafeteria where they would get their meals. And then this was a room that had all of the basic toiletries and some clothes and everything. If they came with nothing, which many of them did, they could get supplies here. And one thing I hadn't realized, I think, before going on this trip, is that most people who are crossing the border here do only stay for 24 to 48 hours in Texas, in El Paso. They go on almost immediately to other cities around the country. And in fact, the very first room that we came into, they had about, 6 or 7 people sitting at tables to help people make their travel plans, that they were getting bus tickets for them, getting plane tickets for them, and figuring out who's your contact person when you go to Denver, like who are you going to be meeting. And so that they set up all of that for them as well. And then the last thing we did at the Welcome Center was meet with a couple of nurses who talked about some of the really pretty dire situations they deal with, people coming in after having come all the way through the Darien Gap in many cases and had a very difficult, arduous trip. And indeed some heartbreaking cases of like a 10-year-old boy that they recently treated who had a gash on his leg about that long from getting cut by the razor wire when trying to cross the river. And so they are doing their best to patch people up and get them in good health before sending them on. And again, to echo Larry's point about just the incredible work that these people are doing. And that would be the other thing I would mention in terms of the impact it had on me, in addition to challenging some of my preconceived ideas that were just wrong. The second one would be to see just the incredible work that these people are doing on a daily basis, and just the dedicating their lives, in some cases 30, 40 years. We saw people that have been working their entire careers, helping people at the border. And it's just amazing, the work that they're doing. And you generally don't see that when you read the news accounts. We tend to see more the bad news and the crisis at the border. We don't read about just the day in, day out amazing humanitarian work that's going on down there. So I'd say that's the other really eye-opening thing for me. So, okay, so Sarah's cutting me off. Oh wait, sorry, one last point, sorry. My other visual aid I brought. So the other thing I think that in terms of changing our conceptions about the so-called border crisis, first of all, that we didn't see a border crisis there at the border. I think the challenges are more in the other cities around the country. But I mentioned this last week, but there's yet another article in the paper this morning, immigrant labor is key to a soft landing so far. And economists now are saying the reason we haven't gone into a recession, which most people thought we would, and everybody was saying 12 months ago we're going to be in a recession in 2024. We had the inverted yield curve, which always means we're going to have a recession. It didn't happen. And everyone's like, why didn't it happen? Well, the reason it didn't happen, we had an additional 2 million people coming in to the economy that above what was being expected that are working and providing the jobs that other Americans weren't willing to do. And that's the reason our economy has been so strong and that we've not gone into a recession. So that's another one of these unexpected things, I think, that it's important to keep in mind when we think about immigration. So now I'll shut up.
Thanks, David. I'm Raylene, if you don't know who I am, and I was very privileged to be with this group of folks to go down there. I went down, I signed up for this trip thinking that we were going to go down and hand out water or be in the shelters and help people get settled or something. I thought it was going to be a working trip. And I found out it was this immersion trip, but I didn't really know what that was. But I said, well, I'll go anyway. And what I learned is that the BSC feels that Yeah, they can have people from the north come down and spend a couple of days, and a couple of people will get a bottle of water. Or they can have people from the north come down and learn what's going on down there, and then go back up and spread the word. And that they believe was much more effective. And so it's commitment. That's one of the questions that Don posed to us is, how did this change you? And one thing that's changed is that I feel much more committed to speaking out. And so I'm going to talk about day 2. We don't really have a lot of pictures from day 2 because on day 2 we were at the courthouse mostly in the morning. There's a picture of the courthouse on the Spruces. And in the afternoon we spoke with a public defender. This is the day that, this is not immigration court that we're talking about here. This is a criminal court. And I thought, oh, okay, now we're going to hear what everybody's worried about, all of the rapists and murderers that are coming across, and the criminal side of things. Because everyone was going to be in this courtroom is an immigrant who's now entered the criminal justice system of the United States. So the first thing we did was we watched one session. There were 10, it happened to be all 10 men, who were having one kind of hearing or another. It was either an initial appearance or a plea hearing. I don't think we had any sentencing hearings. And the first takeaway for me was that of the 10, 9 were Mexican citizens who did in fact get involved in the criminal justice system in the United States. All 9 of them, the crime was re-entry after deportation, which is now a crime, a felony. So the only criminal justice involvement that they have is because we made a rule and says, here's a line, you can't cross it. And if you cross it and we send you back and you cross it again, now you're a felon. Okay. All of these 9 guys were coming to try to find work or to reunite with their families. Not exactly criminal minds. And the only one in this group who was actually being charged with drug trafficking and gun trafficking was a white guy from Denver. So that was an interesting awareness. I know it's a sample of 10, but we had an opportunity to speak to the magistrate after that. After the hearing was over, he came out and he spent an hour talking with us, very, very thoughtful. And again, this is not someone who they're just doing this to punch the time clock. He was really committed to trying to see justice served. He knew he had to, follow the laws of the United States and, send people back if they were here illegally. But I heard compassion, and I heard him wanting better lives for these folks. So we asked a question. I'll frame the rest of my remarks in terms of a question that we asked just about everybody that we met. What would you change if you were in charge? And the first thing he said was that he would reinstate easily accessible work permits. That the vast majority of folks that he sees, that he has to charge criminally and deport and detain, are people who just want to work. They're coming just to have a job because the places they're coming from are so impoverished that, and all they want to do is to come for a little while and work, get a little bit of money, and then go back. They aren't invading. They aren't coming here for any other reason but to raise money so they can go back home. You'll hear a little bit later about some women who just needed to get out, to build a house for themselves. And then we're not talking about a fancy mansion. We're just talking about 4 walls. So he and also the public defender in the afternoon, the first thing they said was work permits. The second thing he said was, we need to improve this system. And I looked around and saw, there all of the court staff. We knew that there were, people from the detention centers that had to guard these prisoners and transport them back and forth. And I'm thinking, every day for years after years after years, how many millions, billions of dollars do we spend just processing people through this irrational system? And what if we instead spent that money on just making sure that they had a way to get to a job and a way to get back? It could be so much easier. And we make the system so hard, you cannot get a work permit now. To get a visa to come over, a work visa, or even to get permission to come in, you have to wait months, and the processing and the people coming over, even if they're approved for seeking asylum, until the system that the Biden administration put in, they had to come across, they get approved to say for asylum, it would be 6 months before they could get a work permit. What are they supposed to do? What are they supposed to live on for 6 months? And so we have just a system that is impossible. I started doing some volunteer work driving people for asylum hearings. One couple that I drove, it was their last chance to file their asylum paperwork or they would be deported. And they didn't really know. They'd been here for a year waiting for this hearing. They weren't ready for the hearing because all of the paperwork is in English. For asylum, you don't get a right to an attorney, and they didn't know how to find an attorney that would be pro bono. They have to tell their story in detail, why they're afraid to go back to the country that they came from, but they have to do it in English. And so we make this system impossible for people to do it legally. And so that was the second thing. And the third thing that he said is that he really thinks that we need to better understand this as a national problem, not a borderlands problem. That they really think that when they think of people in the north, all we do is complain about migrants, okay, about immigrants. But we are setting up systems to help, and like David said, 98% of the people who cross in the El Paso region are only there for 24 to 48 hours, and then they're coming north. What are we doing to make it possible for people to come north? How are we setting things up to help them find jobs and places to live and to support them once they get here? So we've got our part to do.
Thank you. I'll just pick up a little bit on that as we go into Wednesday. So those who've heard my fast reaction in the couple of months since we've been back, was the first word that we heard there was, "This is not a crisis," including the simple phrase, people move. People will always move, and people are going to continue to move. This is about people moving. And that distinction that Raylene was mentioning between borderlands and the interior, we heard over and over that this is a problem in the interior. And so not only what are we going to do with the people, the 98% of the people who are coming into El Paso and looking for something once they get up here, but also just how do we talk about it? That it was so despairing, so disgusting to come back and opening the paper right after we got back and see 4 different articles in the paper all on the same day that related to things at the border, and none of them felt like, yeah, that's what we saw while we were down there. And so I think that's part of the point of this session, is saying there's a different thing going on here than what we hear. As David was saying, the crew that was working on Monday, these young people and their smiles, just astonishing and ready for this work. And so that was some of what we saw on Wednesday as well. frame for Wednesday was largely about visiting kind of the shelter network, getting a taste of that anyway in El Paso. And so there's two different versions of shelter network. There's some that are hospitality centers, and we'll hear more about that. That's the Border Servant Corps Connection and Annunciation House, so we'll get some of that later on. And then there's also a shelter network, and partly these things are in connection with the city of El Paso, and that is a change from how they were early on, because early on El Paso was saying as a city, we don't want this, we don't want it to happen, we're going to try to shut you down. And then they realized, hey, no, actually this is a good thing, thanks for your work, we're going to try to support you. So we visited several different places, each with kind of a different aspect, a different focus, and I'm not going to do a lot on trying to tell you what all of those were. So there were people who, we've been hearing mostly about people who have come across with permission on the CBP One app, the Customs and Border Protection One app, and people who come in and claim asylum. There are people who connect into this who might not have come across and claim asylum, who are trying to just find a way to be. There are people who are migrant workers who are connected in these places. There are people who might just have been residents of El Paso generally who are unhoused, and so some of the shelter network is just about trying to find them some stability and try to keep one of the neighborhoods that's a really old neighborhood in El Paso and has been a broad range of income levels for decades, trying to keep some of that and keep ability for all people to live there. So within that broad spectrum of shelter network, the group really would call this day Dr. Ava Day. Dr. Ava Moya is the chair of the social work department at the University of Texas, El Paso, UTEP, and she is on our radar primarily because of the Dignity Mission Project. So you've perhaps heard some of that here. You can hear some more about that. There she is on the left. That's Dr. Ava there. So she's, I mean, look, she's not much taller than I am when I'm kneeling, and this woman packs a punch. And so Dignity Mission Project comes to us from the Tubasings and their congregation in Placitas, New Mexico, and is about purchasing supplies just to help people with little bits of life. It might be something as simple as hygiene products or something like that, a coloring book for kids, and notes to say, hey, we're thinking of you, welcome, and it's just really simple stuff. And so Dr. Ava is the one who does the bulk of that distribution. She recently bought a new house so that it would have a bigger garage so she could store more Dignity kits in her garage. This is the kind of woman she is. So there on the left, we're delivering some Dignity kits at Sagrado Corazon, that's Sacred Heart, one of the prime spots within sight of the border crossing. And so as Dr. Ava was wandering around there, she was saying, oh, we can take the sidewalk up on the street, but normally I like to take the alleys because then you can really see what's going on and see if there are syringes around and this kind of thing. I mean, this is some of the kind of woman she is on just her awareness. And so we got to Sacred Heart, Sagrado Corazon, and she asked, how are you doing on things here? What are your supplies? And one of the guys working there said, oh, we're short on large men's clothes. And she said, oh, I just heard that this place has extra of those, so why don't you talk to them? They'll be able to give you some of those. And this is how she was in every place we went. She had this sort of sense of connections and how to bring things from here to there. And what was the food she got a bunch of? So we were trying to figure out who could use the supplies that she just sort of randomly ended up with. Larry said to her, I'm glad that you're doing the work you're doing because you would have made an awesome drug lord. And he continues to feel apologetic, I think, for it, or to want to explain himself, that she had just this sense of networking and where everybody was and what they needed. So just a fabulous woman. Was another little story about her. So we were leaving from the Opportunity Center, and we were going to go up to a different part of town to eat at the Mustard Seed Cafe, which is a pay-what-you-can cafe, and they've got some gardens, so it felt a little bit like an MCC backyard with the gardens there. there we are eating with Carmen, the director. She's got her T-shirt on just like the group does. So this is where the T-shirts come from. And so we were leaving to drive to the other part of town, and Ava said, I need gas, so let's pull off at this gas station. She pulls off at the gas station. We see her wandering away from her vehicle as she's handing off a blanket and something else to a homeless guy who was just sitting on the curb at the gas station. You know, she has the eyes, she's got the resources, she just can make things happen. So really exciting, I think, to get to connect with her, because she still is using us as a resource. We'll hear more about that at the end of things here. And so then from that kind of intense, it was interesting, these shelters this day I think felt a little grittier, you know, yeah, just sort of walking into the Welcome Center, had people around the perimeter of the room on some mattresses and just sort of sitting there waiting. Some rougher parts of town. Oh, I was going to say with Sacred Heart, another of this just resourcing version of things. So in the last wave, they were saying we had 2,000 more people than we could fit into the overnight shelters. And we got mattresses and lined up the sidewalk, and we had food that was coming for them. And so we figured out how to help them have something. And so again, that version of it's not a crisis, they just said, well, we've got 2,000 extra people. What are we going to do with them? How do we take care of them? How do we get them what they need? And still, even then, when you had people lining the sidewalk, was still just, yeah, let's do this. And so, I mean, that's some Eva mentality. That's some of these volunteers who are working in these places. Sarah says I'm out of time. So White Sands is how we ended the day, and just such a different feeling from the grittier part of the day. No, I'm not going to say anything about that. I'm out of time. So we were hearing about that one of the things that they would do is have these checks along the highways, and as we're driving up to White Sands, here was one where you had to drive through this station, and so it was just a spot that was not at the border, was up in the interior a little bit, where they would watch and see who was coming through, and so be checking vehicles, and if you seemed like you were trying to sneak into the country, they would have another chance to stop you there. The top right there was an oryx. It's an animal that was imported from Africa. Raylene wants to go and hunt them. So here's some of the White Sands, and gypsum sand, fairly newly designated as a national park. Really interesting way to sort of end that day after the gritty part earlier.
So Thursday, I'm Joyce, for those who don't know me. And on Thursday, we had the opportunity to cross over the border and go into Mexico. We had wanted to do this. There were some obstacles. We found out that a lot of car rental companies do not like you to take your car over the border. And so we did find one. We were persistent. We found one, and we made all the arrangements, and we were on our way to Mexico that day. We started by going shopping, partly with donations from you all. We had a list of things that were needed where we were going to be visiting over in Mexico. So we shopped for children's jackets and coats, especially things that were layerable, since the temperature can change a lot where they are. And also some adult diapers and bed pads, which I'll explain a little bit more later. So with the good sales and fast work, we were able to do quite well, and with David keeping track of our funds for us so that we didn't overspend, we packed everything up in our van and we headed to the border where we were going to be crossing at the Santa Teresa port of entry, which is more rural. And it's, if you remember the map that Sarah shared earlier, we were going to be crossing away from the central part of the city. It's a place where a lot of the trucks come across. So we were meeting Ashley there. Ashley is a fairly new employee of BSC, and she hadn't been across the border either, so this was going to be an adventure. So we got together in our van, and we headed across at the checkpoint. Going across, we were not detained. They didn't ask for our passports. There wasn't a big line or anything. So we headed across the border, and it was very bleak there. There was not a lot of good vegetation. There was a lot of trash around. We could see the wall was right there. And we headed for Anapra, which is a very poor border town. It originally was just a squatter town, and there still are some squatters there. But they have developed this into a community, a colonia, they called it, a neighborhood, and they are trying to improve it, and people are staying there and they're settling there. So we met up with Estela and Berta, and we followed them to the library, La Biblioteca, where they work for their ministry there. So they have, I would say, really two focuses. One is to work with children. They have the children come and read. They have activities for the children and their families. They really encourage them to stay in school. When the moms come, they encourage them to continue their education if possible. Sometimes the dads come too and help with different projects if they may be working during the day. Maybe they can still come and help with some of the projects. So you can see the little areas where the children are and where they come and where they have crafts and different activities for them and their families, and try to build a sense of community here. They also have a program for the abuelos, the grandparents, the older people in the community, especially those who are living on their own, maybe can't get out and so forth. And that's why we were buying adult diapers and bed pads. So they visit these people, make sure that they have what they need, make sure they have food, their medications and so forth. And this is the biblioteca. When you think of a library, you probably think of something a little grander and larger. It was very modest. Anapra is very poor. Dirt streets, just a lot of poverty. But we met these two amazing women there, and that was the highlight of the day for me, Estela and Berta. And both of these women had experienced many major challenges in their own lives. In transition, being without permanent housing, a lot of trauma. And here they were donating their time, working to help this community to improve the situation and build community in this very poor area. So we shared lunch with them, and then we heard their stories, and I want to share just a little bit of Berta's story. So if it's not a book, it should be a book, I think. I'm going to name it Mañana, because that's what it's about. So Berta and her family, I think 4 kids, 5, and husband, were living with other family in a more developed area of Juarez. And the situation was not healthy, and Berta didn't feel like she could raise her kids the way she wanted them to be raised. So she picked them up, and they came to Anapra and decided to settle there. Her husband came too. He had some issues. Eventually, he did pass away. So they basically built this pallet houses. They build these houses out of pallets, and sometimes there's cardboard houses, and very, very, just rustic shelters and so forth. And so her children would say to her, well, I know Grandma's wasn't the best, but, at least we had running water, and, maybe we should be going back. And she would say, well, I need you to go collect some wood so we can have a fire tonight and cook some food, or go get some water and so forth. And they'd get to the end of the day, and she would say, well, it's too late now to go back. Maybe tomorrow, mañana. And this would go on, and the children would do that. And then eventually the kids got involved in school, and at one point her house burned, her pallet house burned, and the mission there and the volunteers helped her build it even better, and she has a house now. But now her kids are all grown, and I think they're all out on their own, either in college or have jobs and so forth. They're doing well. And she will say to them sometimes, well, maybe now that you're all on your own, maybe it's time for me to go back to a more established part of Juarez. And they say to her, mañana. So it was just really inspiring to hear these women's stories who had done so much, who had experienced so much in their own lives, but here we're working and helping people. So we left there and we went to cross over back into the United States. And this time we did have a line. We were in line for, what, a half hour or more? More than that, hour and a half? In line, actually, for an hour and a half?
Can you read the fence?
This is a view of the wall.
Somebody said, don't take a picture of it, so I took a picture of it. I said, Sarah, you're putting that slide in? And Larry said, it is adult ed.
So we were in line for quite a while, and we would see trucks pulled across over, and they would have officers with dogs searching them. There were helicopters flying over, even drones. It was kind of a tense situation. I mean, we weren't concerned, but a lot of people, you know, they have to go through this every day, going back and forth over the border. And this time, they did take our passports. They collected all our passports and, you know, looked them over and gave them back to us. And then we were back in the United States. Yes, you can share that if you want.
So I put this in this, we stopped at the welcome centers because Nick wanted maps. And they have these lovely little shelters for you to picnic in that are out of wind and dust. And they kindly tell you to beware of the rattlesnakes. So we don't get that here. So I get to wrap things up here for Friday, which was a wrapping up, it turns out. The BSC did a really good job organizing this trip between starting us on our first starting us with Chamisal, which is really symbolic of everything that happens there, of the arguing about the border, let's encase the border in concrete so it doesn't move, and then have a treaty that gives Mexico actually a lot more land than the U.S. got right there. To having, to starting on Monday with the process that the migrants experience in order with the border and then port of entry and then the welcome center and then the airport. But the pecan trees that were on the first slide there are also symbolic of a lot of what happens there, because they take, this is the biggest pecan growing area in the country, and they take a lot of irrigation, and all of that comes out of the Rio Grande, which is having drought. So there are a lot of water problems, and there are treaties between Mexico and the US that are about water too. So, but anyway, that's why that slide's there. So we had two really good people to visit with on Friday. We had Ruben Garcia, who has been running Annunciation House in El Paso for 45 years. It's the biggest of the shelter systems in El Paso, and he also kind of coordinates all the other shelters. Like, he gets calls from Border Patrol and saying, we've got 152 people coming in, where can we put them? And then he calls people. Or a Border Patrol person called while he was talking to us, and he said, I have to take this phone call, and it was a Border Patrol person who was at the hospital with somebody he had apprehended who had COVID and was, I think, in ICU. And he said, what do I do? And Ruben said, well, you just keep track of him. He's got to stay in the hospital. When he's well enough, then we'll figure out what to do with him. And usually that means putting him, once they're out of the hospital, in a hotel, not in a shelter, so they can't infect anyone. But the other person we talked to that day was Dr. Natividad, who is a professor at New Mexico State University. He's in the criminal justice department, but had just managed to start a Department of Borderlands and Ethnic Studies. He said he was going to stay in criminal justice because one of the things he does is teach the incoming Border Patrol people. And he wanted to keep doing that. And I just want to tell you a couple of things from Dr. Natividad's lecture, and then I'm going to go back to Ruben Garcia. These are a couple of things that I wrote down from that lecture. All immigration law has been created by immigrants or descendants of immigrants. Just think about that. All immigration law has been created by immigrants or descendants of immigrants. Then he also said, immigration policy and societal constructs make our understanding of inclusion and exclusion. Your trip, he was saying to us, so our trip is deconstructing how we've been programmed to dehumanize others. And then he said that he had a quote from somebody else who I wrote down Gloria, but I don't know Gloria who. What we are suffering from is an absolute despotic duality that says we are able to be only one or the other. So he and Ruben Garcia he gave us lots of information, as a professor does, about the whole history of border policy and ideas of that. Ruben Garcia, on the other hand, kind of lectured us about our duties. It almost felt a little admonishing, actually. And there was another church there, too. And then at the end, he said, you don't really belong here. I mean, your job is really in the interior. And what you should be doing is going back and talking to your neighbor over a cup of coffee and saying, what do you think about what's going on at the border? And then just try to share your experiences, because what we need to change are the laws, and that comes from the people, and that comes from the interior, as well as the helping. And it was, so he ended up not admonishing us, really. It was really powerful, though, because this is this person who has helped all his life and telling us we need to continue helping. And on that note,
just one side note with Ruben. Shortly after we got back, Ken Paxton, the Attorney General of Texas, was trying to shut down Annunciation House, asking them to provide 45 years of records of who they had helped come across the border, and really just clearly trying to attack this support for migrants. And they've got it stayed now, but it was a high-profile kind of thing in the news right after we got to be with Ruben.
My name's Don Tubising. I did not go on this trip for other reasons, but I have been there and met all these folks, and Nancy and I have been there quite often. But what I want to reflect on, we'll make a transition here. MCC has a long history of trying to support people, and I just wrote, we've only been members 16 years, but what I know about is the Central American and driving people in the 70s and 80s up to the Canadian border, the Haiti Allies of putting young Haitians through college, Liberia support, the farmers support here when people were desperate and couldn't pay their bills. I look out here and I see many of you who have already hosted somebody on your own. You did, so that's the mood of this place, which I celebrate. And we've had a sanctuary committee, and we remodeled downstairs, you know, and spent some money to get sanctuary. And that wasn't appropriate anymore. It wasn't really what people were coming and needing. And so here is a research team that went to find out what could this congregation do as part of its continuing mission. And I must say, I hope you agree, we did a heck of a job of finding a research team. And thank you. The next step is, what happens when you listen to God? Well, about 3 weeks after they came back, Nick and I got a call or an email from Eva Moya, who is the activist and the angel, and she described, there are two people sitting here on the border. One is 24, his name is Oswaldo, and his wife is 22, her name is Mariana. I can't say all the other three names, so I'll just stop there. And she is a Mexican citizen, and he came from Venezuela, so they both have work permits. I won't go into the details of that. He has his driver's license. But she went to see her family in Mexico, and on the way back, she got caught in the group that runs the border, and that is the gangs and the mafia, and was kidnapped, and he spent all his money getting her back. So make it short. The call came, and the question was, can you and Madison at MCC do anything? And everybody said, what's the question? We're doing it. So they arrive on Wednesday morning. Already, Roger and Linda have offered a place to stay for up to 3 months in their house in an apartment. We're looking for, we've looked for clothes. People have been shopping and organizing it. And you can just imagine what other ways help may be found that is useful. And so we're on a journey. It's sort of like Abraham. Well, where are we going? Well, I'm not telling you exactly. But you can trust me. And here is a quote I'll end with. And here's where we are. You're going to be involved too, I hope, if you feel moved to. But in this and in other ways, in defense, a person said, I never said I thought I could change the world, but I reserve my right to put the stubborn ounces of my weight to make a difference for someone. Jesus didn't change the whole Roman Empire or all the suffering. Jesus healed people he met along the way. That's our call. We heal and reach out to those who we meet along the way. We don't change the whole world. That's why they call us Christians.
Okay, you said that the border patrol people were more, it humanized it for you, and that was in Las Cruces. But then seeing the border control people on the other side looked a lot more intimidating. Can you tell me about like what they were like?
Yes, I don't know, speaking for everyone, but yeah, you're right. I think going across the border was a more intimidating feeling because the border, where you're coming through, you realize that's where people will get apprehended, and if you have an American passport, it's just you have to wait, and they'll wave you through eventually. And so I don't think any of us felt like at risk that we were going to be detained because we were American citizens. But you do realize, because you do see the people with the automatic weapons and the dogs and the helicopters and the drones, and you realize this is a very sort of militarized kind of thing. And so you're right, that was a very different feel than that first day of talking to the border agents where we saw the more human side of it. And so it's just another good example of that complexity of this issue, and trying to hold these conflicting things in your head at the same time is challenging. So.
10 10 seconds, no more.
I was just going to say, if you're coming across at a port of entry and they have papers or the CBD app or anything like that, that's different than if they come between port of entries. That's when they get an encounter with the Border Patrol. So that's
Glad we could answer all of your questions. Next week during this hour are Earth Day projects, so you can come ready to work on those. Mostly outside. We'll have something happening inside for those who need that. 2 weeks from now, another of these kind of premier listening sessions. We'll get to hear from our confirmation students and their mentors about what they did on Lent projects for the season. Thank you all. Obviously, continue to talk to these people, hear more of their stories. We decided that mostly the hour was best for you hearing from them rather than doing some more of this back and forth. But go ahead with your back and forth after. Thanks. Thanks, crew.